The morning Susan Langston rode onto the Dalton property. She had mud on her boots, fire in her eyes, and 17 head of cattle behind her that did not belong to her one single bit. The Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1882 was a wild and beautiful and unforgiving stretch of land, where the sky stretched so wide it made a person feel both small and infinite at the same time. The grass had come back green after a long, dry winter, and the creeks were running clean and cold, and the wind moved through everything like it on the whole country, which, in a manner of speaking, it did. Susan had lived on the eastern edge of that country all her 24 years, first with her father and mother on the Langston homestead, and then, after her father passed from a fever 2 winters ago and her mother went to live with her sister in Amarillo, alone. Just Susan and the land and the work and the quiet, which was the kind of quiet that pressed in close on cold nights and made a person talk to themselves just to hear a human voice. She had found the cattle wandering in her southern pasture 3 days before. At first she had thought they were strays from the open range, which was still common enough in the Panhandle in those days, even as the big ranchers were starting to string their barbed wire and argue over every acre. But she had looked closer at the brand, the lazy D looped inside a circle, and she had recognized it from the talk in town. Elijah Dalton's brand. The Dalton spread was 12 miles to the west of her, a cattle operation that had been growing steadily since Elijah came down from Kansas 4 years prior with enough money, enough stubbornness, and enough skill with a rope to make something real out of nothing. She had not met him personally. She had seen him once from across the street in Clarendon, the town nearest to both their properties, and she had thought he looked serious. Dark hat, dark eyes, jaw like something carved from the red rock bluffs down by the river. He had been talking with the banker and had not looked up. She had gone about her business and had not thought about it much afterward, or so she had told herself. But now she had his cattle, 17 of them, eating down her spring grass, and that was a problem that needed resolving. She could have sent word. She could have ridden into Clarendon and left a message at the feed store, which was how people communicated such things. But the truth was that 3 days of wrestling 17 ornery cattle back from where they kept trying to drift, and losing sleep listening to them bellow in the night, had put a particular sharpness into Susan Langston that could only be satisfied by delivering them back herself and saying her piece directly. So she saddled her mare, a buckskin named Hazel, tied the cattle into a rough drove with help from her 2 dogs, a heeler named Cal and a shepherd mix named Bess, and she set out west across the rolling grassland with the morning sun at her back and the wind in her face and 17 cattle lowing and complaining the entire way. It took most of the morning. The land rose and fell in long, gentle swells, cut through here and there by dry creek beds that were running shallow now with the spring melt, and she had to keep the dogs working hard to keep the cattle from spreading. By the time she came down off the last long rise and saw the Dalton ranch below her, she was tired and dusty, and her patience had been worn down to a very thin and brittle thing. The ranch was more impressive than she had expected. Not fancy, nothing showy, but solid. A main house built from good timber with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. A large barn painted the deep red that was common out here. Several outbuildings, 2 corrals, one of them holding horses. There was a bunkhouse off to the east and a windmill turning slow in the morning air over a water tank. And beyond the yard the pasture rolled green and wide with cattle scattered across it like dark seeds on a pale cloth. There were hands working in the near corral, 2 of them, and one man standing outside the fence with his forearms resting on the top rail, watching. As Susan came down the slope with her drove, she saw that man turn to look. He was tall. Even from this distance she could see that clearly. He pushed off the fence and walked toward her, and there was something in the way he moved, unhurried but purposeful, that made her sit a little straighter in the saddle. She brought the cattle down into the yard and pulled Hazel up short and looked down at Elijah Dalton, who was looking up at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not surprised, exactly. More like a man who had just seen something he did not quite know what to do with and was taking his time deciding. He was 31 years old, she would later learn. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges of his hat brim, and his eyes were indeed dark, the kind of dark brown that could look almost black in shadow and warm as good earth in full sunlight. He had a few days of beard on his jaw, and his shirt was already showing the morning's work on it, and he smelled of horses and leather and wood smoke, which was not an unpleasant combination. 17, Susan said, because she had been rehearsing what she intended to say for 12 miles, and that was how she had decided to start it. 17 head, all bearing your brand, found in my south pasture 3 days ago. They ate down a 1/4 acre of my spring grass, and one of them broke through my fence, and I spent half a day repairing it. I would appreciate knowing how they got through to my property in the first place, because if your fence on the western side is in poor repair, this is a problem that will recur. Elijah Dalton looked at the cattle. He looked back at her. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair and put it back on. "Miss," he said, and then he stopped, and she could see him reassessing whatever he had been about to say. "I am Elijah Dalton. This is my property. Those are indeed my cattle, and I thank you for returning them. My name is on the brand." "I know your name," Susan said, "and my name is Susan Langston. My property borders yours to the east. The fence situation between our properties is apparently inadequate." He did not look away from her, and she found that she respected that. A lot of men, when a woman spoke to them with directness, looked somewhere else, as if her directness were a bright light they could not quite meet. Elijah Dalton met it. "Susan Langston," he said, like he was placing the name in a specific drawer in his mind. "I know your property. I did not know you were still working it alone." "I am still working it alone," she said, and there was a note in her voice that she could not fully suppress, something between pride and exhaustion. "The fence. I will have men ride the fence line today," he said, "and I will pay you for the grass and for the fence repair." "I did not come here for payment," she said, though in truth that had been part of what she intended to say, and now that he had offered it so readily she found she did not want to take it from him that way. "I came to return your cattle and to make certain this does not happen again." "I appreciate that," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that was not quite formal anymore. He looked at the cattle again and then at her dogs, who were sitting at Hazel's heels with their tongues out, looking pleased with themselves. "You drove these 12 miles with 2 dogs and no help." "They are good dogs," she said. He looked at her again, and something moved across his face, something warm and private that he pulled back before it could fully surface. "They are," he said, "and so is the woman who worked them." She had not expected that. She felt something shift in her chest, a small and quiet thing, like a door opening somewhere inside a house she had thought was fully settled. She said nothing, because there was nothing she could think to say that would not either encourage him too much or dismiss him too sharply, and she was not certain which of those she wanted to do. "Miss Langston," he said, "you have ridden 12 miles this morning, and your dogs look like they could use water. My men are about to break for the midday meal. I would take it as a kindness if you would accept some food and rest before the ride back." She looked at the sun. It was moving toward noon, true enough. She looked at Hazel, who was breathing steady but would be glad of the rest. She looked at Cal and Bess, who were looking up at her with an expectation that clearly supported the idea of water and rest. "For the horses and dogs," she said. "I will stay for that." He nodded and called to one of the hands in the corral, a young man with red hair and a cheerful face, who came forward and offered to take Hazel to the water trough, and Cal and Bess followed after with great enthusiasm. Elijah turned toward the house and gestured for her to come, and she climbed down from the saddle and followed him up the porch steps and into the front room of the Dalton house. It was a good house inside. She had not known what to expect, a bachelor's house. She had imagined something roughly furnished and carelessly kept, but the main room was clean and well ordered, with a stone fireplace on the north wall and a table that could seat 6 and a bookshelf with actual books on it. There were curtains on the window, plain blue cotton, and she found herself wondering about them, who had put them up and why. As if he saw the question, he said, "My mother came out from Kansas 2 summers ago and stayed 3 months. She said the house needed curtains and she was not wrong." "They are nice curtains," Susan said, and felt slightly foolish saying it. She would be pleased to hear that, he said, and there was a warmth in his voice when he talked about his mother that Susan filed away without meaning to. He brought out bread and cold beef and a jar of preserved peaches and set them on the table with plates, and then he poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, which was still hot from the morning. He sat across from her and did not make a performance of the meal, did not talk too much or too little, and she found that she was more comfortable than she had expected to be sitting in a strange man's house eating his food. "How long have you been working the Langston place alone?" he asked after a while. 2 years, she said. "My father passed. My mother went to Amarillo. That is a lot of land for one person." "Yes," she said simply. "Do you have help at all? I hire day labor when I need it, branding harvest, and I have the dogs." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. Then he said, "You must be very capable." She looked at him to see if there was condescension in it, because sometimes when men said that they meant it as an expression of disbelief rather than admiration. But she found no condescension. He said it straight and meant it straight. "I have had to become so," she said. "I understand that," he said. "I came here with $400 and a horse and no idea at all what I was doing. The land teaches you if you let it." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Is that how you came here, from Kansas with $400? "And a horse," he said. "Do not forget the horse. The horse was the important part." She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and she saw the way it affected him, the way something in his face opened up when she laughed, like he had been hoping for it without knowing it. "Where in Kansas?" she asked. "Wichita," he said. "I worked cattle drives up from Texas for 3 years before I decided I would rather own the cattle than trail them for someone else. I saved enough to buy the starting stock and the land, and I came south." "Why the Panhandle?" "The grass," he said, simply and honestly. "Have you seen it in a wet year? There is nothing like it anywhere." She had seen it in a wet year. She had grown up in it. And something in the way he said it, with that uncomplicated reverence, made her feel a kinship with him that surprised her with its ease. They talked through the meal and passed it, and when the hands came in for their own food they were introduced to Susan, and they were polite and respectful. And one of them, an older man named Pete with a gray mustache and knowing eyes, looked between her and Elijah with an expression that he did a poor job of concealing. Elijah did not notice, or pretended not to. After the meal, Elijah said he wanted to count the returned cattle and record them against his tally, which was a sensible and practical thing to do, and Susan said she would wait, which was a sensible and practical response. He went out to where the cattle had been herded into the smaller corral, and he began to count them. She stood at the corral fence and watched him. He moved through the cattle slowly, methodically, touching each one on the flank as he passed, sometimes stopping to check a foot or an ear or a patch of hide that had caught his attention. He was very slow about it. Almost, she thought, unreasonably slow for a man who had 2 experienced hands standing by and a perfectly clear tally to check against. He counted once and then started again. He wrote something in a small ledger he had brought out from the house. He counted a 3rd time. He paused to look at a heifer who was clearly fine in every particular, and spent a long moment examining her ear before making a note in his ledger. Pete, the older hand, caught Susan's eye from across the corral. He smiled slowly and looked away, and Susan felt the heat rise in her face in a way she had not felt in a very long time. Elijah Dalton was counting slowly because he did not want her to leave. She knew it the way you know certain things in the Panhandle, not because anyone tells you, but because the air changes and the light shifts and something in you that is older than words simply understands. She stood at the fence and let herself understand it, and she looked at the back of his dark hat and his wide shoulders, and the careful way his hands moved over each animal, and she felt something bloom in her chest that she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. She did not leave. She stayed at the fence, and eventually he came to the end of his count, which she suspected he could have completed in a quarter of the time, and he wrote his final notation in the ledger and closed it and looked up at her. 17, he said. That is what I told you, she said. I like to be thorough, he said. You certainly are, she said, and she watched him recognize that she knew, and she watched him decide not to pretend otherwise, and she respected that decision so much it almost hurt. Miss Langston, he said, coming to lean his forearms on the top rail of the fence, which put them very close together. I wonder if you might do me the kindness of showing me exactly where on the eastern fence line the cattle got through. I should like to look at it myself before I send the men to repair it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and somewhere behind them a mockingbird was running through its whole complicated vocabulary. That is a 12-mile ride, she said. I know it, he said. She was quiet for a moment. You could start at first light tomorrow and be there by mid-morning, she said. I will have the fence line located by then. I will be there, he said. She called her dogs, and the young red-haired hand brought Hazel around, rested and watered and looking better for it, and Elijah walked her to where the mare stood. He helped her mount, which she did not strictly need, but she allowed it, and when his hand was at her boot for a moment she was aware of it the way you are aware of a fireplace in a cold room, not burning, not uncomfortable, just warmly, persistently present. She rode east with the afternoon sun dropping toward her back, and she did not look behind her, but she knew he watched her go because that was the kind of thing she simply knew now. Cal and Bess ran alongside, happy and tireless, and the panhandle spread around her in every direction, and the grass moved in the wind, and Susan Langston rode home feeling something she had not felt in 2 years. Not alone. She did not sleep particularly well that night. She lay in the dark of the small bedroom that had been her parents', and listened to the wind and told herself she was simply anticipating the practical matter of the fence inspection, which needed to happen for entirely sensible reasons related to the security of her southern pasture. She told herself this several times, and it did not work particularly well. Around midnight, she got up and made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at the kitchen table in her nightgown and lamplight, and admitted to herself that she was thinking about a man, which was not the end of the world, but which required a certain amount of careful management going forward. She had not had room for thinking about men in 2 years. There had been too much work, too much worry, too many cold mornings that needed her whole attention just to get through. And before that, before her father's illness took all the space in the house and in her mind, there had been a young man in Clarendon, William Hare, who had spoken to her for a season and then married the banker's daughter in the spring of 1880, which had hurt in the way these things hurt, which is to say considerably for a while and then less, and then not at all, so that now when she passed William and his wife on the street she felt nothing but a mild and abstract well-wishing. But this was different. She could feel the difference clearly, the way you feel the difference between a lamp and the sun. It was not comfortable, this feeling. She was not a woman who found discomfort pleasing, but she sat with it in the lamplight and drank her tea and decided that she would see what the morning brought. He arrived at 10 o'clock, which was earlier than she had expected, which meant he had ridden out before first light. She was working the kitchen garden when she heard Hazel signal his approach from the corral, the mare's head coming up and her ears pricking forward with that particular alertness horses have for company. Susan wiped her hands on her work apron and went to the fence line just as Elijah Dalton came around the east side of her barn on a big bay gelding, with Pete trailing behind him on a gray, and a young hand she had not seen before on a roan. He raised a hand when he saw her. She raised hers back. He rode to the fence and swung down, and Pete and the young hand stayed back at a diplomatic distance, which told Susan that Pete had said something to Elijah that morning, or that Elijah had said something to Pete, and either way it was understood that these two were to have some space between them and the hands. "Miss Langston," Elijah said. "Mr. Dalton," she said. "The breach is about half a mile south along the fence line. I will show you." She went and saddled Hazel, which took her a few minutes and which he did not offer to help with because he seemed to understand that she would not want him to, and they rode south together along the fence line while the hands followed at their respectful distance. It was a good morning for riding. The sky was the particular blue that only appears in the Panhandle in spring, a deep and saturated blue that looks as if it has been poured from some infinite vessel, and the air smelled of fresh grass and the faint iron scent of the creek to the south, and the meadowlarks were going at full volume in the grass on both sides. "It is beautiful land," Elijah said, looking around. "It is," she agreed. "Your father homesteaded it. He came in 1868, she said. Before the Comanche raids were fully ended out here, it was more dangerous then." He nodded. "You were young then." "I was 10 years old when we came," she said. "I remember the first night in the dugout we built before the house was finished. My mother cried quietly because she thought we were all going to die in this place. My father told her that the land needed us as much as we needed it and that it would take care of its own. She told him he was a fool. She was probably right." He smiled at that and she saw warmth in it. "Did the land take care of them?" She was quiet for a moment. "For a long time," she said. "My father loved every acre of it right up until the end. He died in the house he built, which is more than a lot of men can say." "It is," he said. They rode in companionable silence for a stretch, and she found that the silence was not uncomfortable at all, that it had the same quality as the silence inside a good house on a cold night, not empty, but filled with something invisible and warm. "Here," she said, pulling up where the fence line dipped into a shallow draw. She pointed to where 3 posts had gone over and the wire had snapped and been pushed aside, the ground around it churned up by cattle hooves. "They came through here. I think the posts were rotten at the base. You can see it." He dismounted and went to look, crouching down to examine the base of the posts, running his hand along the wood. He was careful and thorough, and she watched him work and tried to focus on the practical matter at hand. "You are right," he said, looking up at her. "These posts are gone. I should have ridden this fence line in the fall. I did not, and you paid for it. I am sorry." It was a plain and straightforward apology with no hemming around it, and she appreciated it more than she could easily say. "These things happen," she said. "See that they are replaced properly." "They will be," he said, standing and turning to Pete. "Get the posts and wire from the wagon. We will fix this today." Pete and the young hand got to work, and Elijah came back and stood near her while the repairs got underway, because there was not much for him to do himself with 2 hands working. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said, which was a frank thing to say, and he seemed to know it. "The fence line between our properties runs about 3 miles, she said. "Who is responsible for which sections?" He considered this. "In the absence of any agreement, it would be reasonable to split it down the middle. But I will tell you honestly, Miss Langston, that I have the resources to maintain all of it, and I would rather take that on than have you carrying it alone." She looked at him steadily. "I do not need charity." "It is not charity," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "It is good neighboring. The fence protects both our stock. It is reasonable for the party with more resources to carry more of the burden. That is just common sense, not charity." She thought about this for a moment and found that she could not argue with the logic of it, and that the way he had framed it, carefully giving her dignity, made it easier to accept. "Half," she said. "I will maintain my half." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him decide not to push it. "Half," he agreed. They watched Pete and the young hand work for a while, and then Elijah said, "Miss Langston, I noticed on the ride here that your south windmill looks as though it has been sitting idle." She sighed. "The mechanism is stuck. I have been hauling water for that pasture by hand for 3 weeks. I have sent to Clarendon for the parts, but they have not come yet." "Pete can look at it," he said. "He is as good a windmill man as I have ever seen. He could probably have it running today." She opened her mouth to decline and then closed it again, because 3 weeks of hauling water by hand had left her with a tiredness in her shoulders that did not fully go away even in sleep, and the stubbornness of her pride was not worth that. "If Pete is willing," she said, "I would be grateful." He nodded and said something to Pete that she did not hear, and Pete looked at her and touched his hat brim in a gesture of cheerful willingness, and she felt something ease inside her that she had not known was tensed. It took Pete about 40 minutes to fix the fence posts with the young hand's help, and then he rode with her to the south windmill while Elijah came along and said he would keep her company while Pete worked, which was not strictly necessary but which she did not object to. They sat on the fence near the windmill tank and talked while Pete climbed the tower and made his inspection. "Tell me about Kansas," she said. "About Wichita," he told her. He talked about working the cattle drives, about the long, dusty months on the trail, about the heat and the storms and the beauty of seeing a thunderstorm move across the open plain like a dark curtain being drawn from east to west. He talked about the particular loneliness of trail work, always moving, never rooted, and how it had made him want roots more than almost anything. He talked about riding south for the first time through the Panhandle and seeing the grass running green to the horizon and knowing, with a certainty that had no reasonable explanation but was completely impossible to doubt, that this was where he was meant to stop. She listened to all of it with full attention, and she told him about growing up here, about what it had been like to be a child on the frontier, the wild freedom of it, and the real danger that ran alongside the freedom like a shadow. She told him about learning to ride before she could properly reach the stirrups, about her mother teaching her to read from the same 2 books they owned, and her father teaching her to rope from horseback and to read the weather and to understand what the cattle were telling you if you paid attention to them. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man," Elijah said. "He was," she said, simply and without grief now, only with a quiet love. "He taught me everything I know about this land." Pete came down from the windmill and gave the mechanism a few turns by hand, and the blades began to move and the pump began to work and the water started to flow into the tank, and Susan felt a relief so profound it was almost embarrassing. "Thank you, Pete," she said, with genuine warmth. Pete touched his hat again. "My pleasure, Miss Langston. Good solid old mechanism, just needed the jam cleared. She will run fine now." She looked at Elijah. He was looking at the water running into the tank, with a satisfaction that she understood was not about the windmill but about something larger, about being useful to her, and the understanding of that moved through her like warm light. "I am making dinner," she said. "I insist you all stay." She did not often issue insistences. She could see that all 3 of the men knew it. She cooked a proper meal, beef stew with root vegetables from her cellar and cornbread from her cast-iron skillet, and the 4 of them ate together at her kitchen table, Pete and the young hand, whose name turned out to be Danny and who was 19 and enthusiastic about almost everything, and Elijah, who sat across from her and ate 2 helpings of stew and said it was the best he had eaten in a very long time. "You are just being polite," she said. "I am not," he said. "I grew up on my mother's cooking and I know good stew. This is good stew." "His mother can cook," Pete said, with the authority of a man who had eaten many of Elijah's meals. "But Miss Langston, this rivals it, and I say that with the full knowledge that she would have my hide if she knew I said it." Susan laughed again, and again she saw Elijah track that laugh with something like gladness. After dinner, the men rode back to the Dalton ranch, and the evening came down over Susan's land, and she sat on her porch in the cooling air and listened to the mockingbird and the wind and thought about the day. She thought about the way Elijah had looked at her when she talked about her father. She thought about his hands on the fence post, careful and strong. She thought about the way he had said her name, Susan Langston, placing it carefully, like something he intended to keep. She thought about herself, too, with the honest kind of thinking she did best in quiet. She was 24 years old and she ran a property alone, and she was proud of that, genuinely proud, and she was not willing to give up that pride for any man. But pride did not have to mean loneliness. That was a confusion she had let herself fall into without noticing. In the 2 years since her father died, the conflation of independence with solitude, as if needing no one were the same as wanting no one. She was not certain she wanted no one. She was, in fact, becoming increasingly uncertain about that, with great speed and in a very specific direction. The following Sunday she rode to town for supplies, as she did every week, and she was loading flour and salt and a bolt of muslin into her wagon when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Langston." She turned. He was standing in front of the feed store with a coil of rope over one shoulder and his hat in his hand, which she noticed, the hat in the hand. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "Sunday." "I come every Sunday for supplies," he said. "I did not know you did as well." "Every week," she said. "Then it is strange we have not crossed paths before," he said. "Or perhaps not," she said, because Clarendon was not a large town, but it was large enough that two people on different schedules could move through it without intersection, especially if one of those people was a woman who moved efficiently and did not linger. "Will you take coffee with me?" he asked. "The hotel has a decent dining room." She looked at her wagon, which was loaded. She looked at the son, which had time to spare. She looked at him. "Coffee," she said. They sat in the hotel dining room at a table by the window that looked out onto the main street, and the waitress brought coffee and sugar, and a plate of biscuits that Elijah had not ordered but which appeared anyway, and they talked for an hour and a half. They talked about everything and nothing, about the cattle market and the railroad talk that was moving through the Panhandle, about books, and here she discovered that they had both read Cooper and Dickens, and that he had opinions about Dickens that she found surprising and sharply intelligent. She told him she had been trying to get certain books from the catalog, and he told her the traveling library came through Clarendon twice a year, and that he had an account with it and would be glad to put her name on the list. "I can put my own name on the list," she said. "You can," he said easily. "I only mention it because I have an existing account and it would be simple." She stirred her coffee and looked at him. "You are very careful not to overstep," she said. He met her eyes. "I am trying to be," he said. "I do not always succeed at things I try." The honesty of that disarmed her. She looked out the window for a moment at the Sunday street, a couple of horses at the rail, a woman with a parasol crossing the dusty road, a group of men talking outside the saloon. Normal Sunday life in a small Texas town. And here she sat, having coffee with Elijah Dalton and finding herself not wanting to stop. "Mr. Dalton," she said, looking back at him, "I am going to say something directly." "I appreciate direct," he said. "I have been managing my property alone for 2 years, and I expect to continue managing it alone," she said. "I am not in the market for anyone to manage it on my behalf or to take it on as their own concern. I want to be certain that is understood." He held her gaze steadily. "Understood completely," he said, "and I will say something directly in return if I may." "Please," she said. "I have no interest in managing your property," he said. "I have enough of my own to manage. What I have an interest in is knowing you better, which is a separate matter entirely." She considered him for a long moment. A cart went by outside, the driver calling to someone on the opposite side of the street. The coffee was warm in her hands. "That is a separate matter," she agreed. There was a moment between them then, quiet and clear and full of something that needed no words to describe it, and she sat in it without looking away, which was perhaps the bravest thing she had done in a long while. He began riding over on Saturday afternoons. Not every Saturday at first, but often enough that it became a pattern, and she found that she began to notice Saturday mornings differently, with a particular kind of attention to the angle of the light and the state of the house, and the question of whether there was anything worth offering for the midday meal. She told herself this was normal hospitality, and she believed herself about as much as one could reasonably expect. He would come in the early afternoon, after his own morning work was done, and they would sit on her porch or ride the property or walk the creek bank and talk. She learned about his family, his mother Margaret, who was plain-spoken and funny, and had strong opinions about everything. His father Daniel, who had run a hardware store in Wichita, and died when Elijah was 19. His older brother Thomas, who had stayed in Kansas and taken over the store. His younger sister Clara, who had married a schoolteacher in Dodge City. She told him about her own family's history, about her grandmother who had crossed Tennessee on foot as a girl and her grandfather who had fought in the Mexican War and come home changed, about her mother's practical genius for making something out of almost nothing, which was the skill Susan had inherited most directly. She told him about what had happened in the summer of 1879, when a group of men from a neighboring property had tried to claim a water right on her creek, saying it predated her father's claim. She had taken the matter to the county court herself, with her father's original land papers, and she had won. She told this story matter-of-factly, not as a boast but as a piece of her history, and she watched Elijah's face while she told it and saw nothing there but a quiet and unperformed admiration. "What was the judge's name?" he asked. "Whitfield," she said. "He was fair. Some of them are not." "No," he agreed. "Some of them are not." There was something in that agreement that felt heavier than the words, and she looked at him, and he met her look, and she understood that he had seen things, in his cattle drive years, that went beyond the legal system's capacity for fairness or justice. She did not press it, but she filed it away, understanding that this was a man who had seen enough of the world to know its shape, including its ugly places. One Saturday in late May, a thunderstorm came rolling up from the south while they were walking the creek bank, one of those panhandle storms that gives almost no warning and arrives with tremendous force. They heard the thunder and looked south and saw the wall of green-black cloud already racing over the flat horizon, and Elijah grabbed her hand and they ran, simply ran, back across the pasture to the house, Cal and Bess racing alongside them, and they made the porch just as the first heavy drops came down like thrown stones. They stood on the porch breathing hard and laughing, and the rain came down like a curtain being dropped, and the thunder rolled and cracked overhead, and the lightning lit the whole sky in white. She was holding his hand. They had been running, and she was still holding his hand, and he had not let go either. And then they both became aware of it at the same moment, and neither of them moved. And she looked up at him in the storm-gray light of the porch, and he looked down at her, and the rain roared around them and the lightning came again. "Susan," he said, and it was the first time he had used only her first name, and the way he said it, carefully, like he was saying something irreversible, made her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Elijah," she said back, equally carefully, giving him her own first name like a returned gift, and his hand tightened on hers. They stood like that through the worst of the storm, not kissing, not speaking, just standing close in the roaring rain with their hands linked, and it was one of the most intimate things she had ever experienced. When the storm began to ease, he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles once briefly, with a tenderness so concentrated it made her throat ache, and she stood very still and let him. "I should go," he said. "The creek will be running high. If I wait much longer, the crossing will be difficult." "Yes," she said, because she knew the creek and he was right. He let go of her hand slowly, finger by finger, which was either very romantic or slightly theatrical, and she found she did not mind either possibility. He put his hat back on and walked to his horse and mounted and turned the bay and looked at her one more time on the porch. "Next Saturday," he said. "Next Saturday," she agreed. He rode into the clearing storm, and she watched until he was out of sight, and then she stood a while longer looking at the wash-clean world and feeling the ghost of his hand around hers. Summer came to the Panhandle in full force, and with it all the work that summer demanded. Susan was busy from first light to last on most days, the kitchen garden needing constant attention, the cattle needing moving from pasture to pasture as the grass was used down, the ongoing repair and maintenance of a property that had only one set of hands to tend it. She hired 2 day laborers for the busiest weeks, brothers from a Mexican family named Reyes who lived just east of Clarendon, Felipe and Miguel, who were efficient and honest, and never made her feel anything but respected in her role as their employer. She was aware of the ways in which her situation as a single woman operating a property in this time and place was unusual enough to attract comment. She heard it sometimes in town, the edge of something in the voices of certain older women, the look from certain men that was not quite respectful. She had learned to carry herself in a way that discouraged most of this. A particular quality of self-possession that her father had taught her was worth more than any number of men at her back. But there were moments when the aloneness felt less like independence and more like simple loneliness. And those moments had been increasing in frequency over the summer, in a very clear correlation with a certain man who rode over on Saturday afternoons. Elijah came every Saturday without fail once summer set in. He always brought something, not extravagant gifts, never anything that would feel like he was trying to purchase her goodwill, but practical things. A bundle of fence staples, which she needed. A small tin of the particular tea she had mentioned once that she could not find in Clarendon. A piece of harness leather that was the exact weight she had said she was looking for. Small, specific, useful things that told her he had been listening, which was more meaningful to her than any grand gesture could have been. They sat on her porch and watched the summer evenings come down golden and slow over the grassland. They rode together on her property and on his. He showed her the whole Dalton spread one afternoon in July, riding from corner to corner, nearly 4,000 acres of Panhandle grass with a clear running branch of the creek bisecting it from north to south. She could see what he had built and she was genuinely impressed by it. The good fences, the careful pasture management, the quality of the stock, the solid construction of every building. "You have done well here," she told him. "I have worked at it," he said. "That is the same thing," she said. He looked at her. "You have worked at yours too." "Harder for a woman," she said, not bitterly, just as a statement of fact. "I know it," he said, with a gravity that told her he understood more than the surface of it. On a hot Thursday in late July, she was in town for supplies and ran into a woman she knew slightly, Martha Graves, who was the wife of one of the larger cattlemen in the county. Martha was a pleasant woman, but one who kept close track of the social geography of the region, and she stopped Susan with a hand on her arm and a bright, warm expression that Susan had learned to regard with mild caution. "Susan, I just have to ask," Martha said, with a brightness that was entirely genuine and also entirely without discretion. "Are you and Elijah Dalton courting? Because you were seen in the hotel dining room together in May and there have been horses seen going back and forth, and I am not prying. I am genuinely asking because I think it would be wonderful." Susan looked at her for a moment. "We are neighbors," she said. "We have some shared concerns about the fence line between our properties." "Of course," Martha said warmly, in the tone of a woman who understood fence lines to be an entirely acceptable synonym for courtship. Susan rode home and thought about it seriously. Courting. The word had an odd weight to it. It implied a destination, a trajectory, a set of known steps leading to a known end. She was not certain she had been thinking in those terms. She had been thinking about Saturday afternoons and the feel of his hand and the way he talked about books, and she had not let herself look too far ahead at the shape it was all making. That Saturday, when he arrived, she poured the coffee and they sat on the porch, and she said, without any particular preamble because that was her way, "Martha Graves stopped me in town on Thursday. She asked if we were courting." He did not look surprised and he did not deflect. He looked at her directly and said, "What did you tell her?" "I told her we were neighbors with shared fence concerns," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "Susan, I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to know that whatever your answer is, I will respect it fully." "Ask," she said. He turned to look at her. "Are we courting? Because from where I stand we are, and I have been acting accordingly in my own mind. But if that is not what this is for you, then I would rather know it plainly." She looked at him for a long moment. The summer sky behind him was the deep blue of late afternoon, and the grass was gold in the low sun, and a hawk was turning lazy circles over the south pasture, and everything was very beautiful and very still. "I think," she said slowly, "that we are." The relief on his face was so transparent and so unguarded that she felt something move in her heart that was not quite describable but was entirely good. "I am glad of that," he said. "Do not look so relieved," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. "I cannot help it," he said. "I have been trying to be patient, and I am not naturally patient." "You counted 17 cattle 3 times," she said. "You are more patient than you think." He looked at her, and something passed between them that was part laughter and part tenderness and part the acknowledgement of a truth that had been sitting between them since the very first afternoon. And then they were both laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere real and deep. "I did not want you to leave," he said, and he said it simply, without embarrassment, because they were past embarrassment now. "I know you did not," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her porch chair, and she let him, and they sat in the last of the afternoon sun holding hands like it was the most natural thing in the world, which it was, which it had been since that first afternoon when she stood at his corral fence and watched him count slowly and understood everything. He came for dinner more often after that. He came on evenings too, not just Saturdays. And sometimes she rode to the Dalton place and ate with him and the hands in the big kitchen. And Pete always made a point of including her in the conversation, as though she had been sitting at that table for years. Danny, the young red-haired hand, had taken to talking to her about horses with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who had found a person who would listen seriously, and she did listen, because she liked horses as much as she liked almost anything. In September, a letter came from Elijah's mother, Margaret, in Kansas. He showed it to Susan one Saturday afternoon, which she understood to mean something, the showing of a mother's letter to a woman. "She wants to come for a visit," he said. "In October, when the heat breaks." "She is welcome," Susan said, then caught herself. "I mean, of course she is welcome to visit you." He smiled. "I wondered if she might come meet you as well," he said. "If you would be willing." She thought about this. Meeting the mother, that was a particular kind of milestone, clearly marked. "I would be willing," she said. "She will like you," he said. "She has little patience for women who cannot hold a conversation on practical subjects." "Then we should get along fine," Susan said. Margaret Dalton arrived in Clarendon on the October stage, a compact and vigorous woman of 58 with the same dark eyes as her son and a manner that was direct without being unkind. Elijah brought her out to meet Susan on the second day of her visit, and Susan had prepared properly, with a good dinner and the house as clean and orderly as she could make it, which was quite clean and orderly. Margaret walked through the front room of the house taking in everything, the bookshelves, the curtainless windows, the practical cleanliness of it, and she sat down at Susan's table and looked at her with a directness that Susan recognized and immediately trusted. "My son," Margaret said, "is not easy to live alongside, in case he has not mentioned it. He is stubborn and he keeps his own counsel, and he works too hard and he forgets to eat when he is busy." "None of those are unfamiliar traits in this part of the country," Susan said. Margaret looked at her and smiled, and Susan saw in that smile the same warmth she had seen in Elijah, the same real warmth that surfaced unexpectedly and meant everything it appeared to mean. "He also," Margaret said, "has one of the best hearts I have ever known in a human being, which I say not because he is my son, but because it is simply true." Susan looked at her coffee cup. "I have noticed that," she said quietly. Margaret stayed 3 weeks. She and Susan took to having tea together twice a week, without Elijah, which Susan suspected he had engineered deliberately, and which she did not mind because she genuinely liked the older woman. Margaret talked about Daniel, Elijah's father, about what it had been like to lose him when Elijah was still so young, about how she had watched him take on a gravity that boys his age should not have had to carry. She talked about watching him ride south for the Panhandle and feeling certain she would not see him often enough, and feeling equally certain it was right. "He was always meant for land," Margaret said. "It is in him the way some people carry music or numbers. He just knows it." "I understand that," Susan said. "I know you do," Margaret said, looking at her with those dark eyes. "He told me about your family's homestead, about your father." Susan nodded. "You are alike in that," Margaret said. "Rooted people. Not everyone is. It is good when they find each other." When Margaret left on the November stage, she embraced Susan at the station and held on a moment longer than a polite goodbye required. And Susan returned the embrace and felt the warmth of it settle into her in a way that felt like something being confirmed. That evening Elijah came to her porch and they sat together in the cold November air wrapped in their coats, and the sky was full of stars, the extraordinary stars of the Panhandle winter that appear in numbers so large they seem almost excessive, as if someone has overfilled the sky. "She loved you," he said. "I liked her very much," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Susan, I need to say something to you." "Then say it," she said, because she could hear the weight of it in his voice and she wanted it said. He turned to her on the bench and took both her hands in both of his and looked at her in the starlight and said, "I have been in love with you since the afternoon you rode down that hill with 17 of my cattle and told me they had eaten your grass and broken your fence. I knew it then, and I have known it every day since. I am asking you if you will marry me. I am asking you because I want to spend my life sitting on your porch and riding your land and cooking dinner in your kitchen and being your neighbor and your friend and your husband, if you will have me." The stars were very bright overhead. The cold air moved the grass in the darkness beyond the porch. Somewhere to the south, a coyote called and was answered from far away. She looked at him, at his face in the starlight, at the earnestness that lived in him alongside the strength, at the good heart that his mother had spoken of and that she had verified for herself over months of careful, honest observation. She had told herself she was not in the market for anyone. She had believed it, or tried to. But what she understood now, sitting in the cold November night with her hands in his, was that being self-sufficient did not require being solitary. That strength did not mean closing the door. That she could be fully herself, every capable and particular and proud inch of herself, and still say yes. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Elijah Dalton." He pulled her close then, and the hug was immediate and warm and held longer than a formal embrace, and she leaned into it and felt his arms around her and the warmth of him in the cold night, and she thought, quite clearly and simply, yes. This. He kissed her there on the porch under the stars, and it was a gentle kiss, careful and warm, and she kissed him back, and it was neither of them performing anything, neither of them demonstrating, just two people who had arrived at a true thing and were acknowledging it. The wedding was held in Clarendon on the second Saturday of December in the year 1882, in the small church on the north end of Main Street, conducted by the minister, Reverend Allen, who was a good-tempered man with a genuine liking for the people of his congregation. The church was not large and not fancy, but it was full, which surprised Susan somewhat, though perhaps it should not have. She had been in Clarendon territory for 14 years and Elijah for 4, and between them they had more connections in the community than she had properly counted. Pete stood up with Elijah. Margaret Dalton sat in the front row with Thomas, who had come down from Kansas for the occasion, and Clara, who was there with her schoolteacher husband. The Ray's brothers, Felipe and Miguel, were there with their family, and Danny the young hand was there looking scrubbed and self-conscious. Martha Graves was there and looked profoundly satisfied in the way of a woman whose social intuitions have been publicly validated. There were ranchers and their wives and several families from the outlying homesteads and the man from the feed store, and the woman who ran the dry goods, and the Clarendon schoolteacher and her husband. Susan wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had sent from Amarillo with a letter that read, in its entirety, "I know you were always going to be fine without help, and I am so very glad someone fine enough came along anyway." Her mother could not make the journey from Amarillo, her health being uncertain in the winter cold, but Susan had read that letter several times and carried it with her like a quiet blessing. Elijah was in a good black coat and his best hat, and his dark eyes found her the moment she came through the church door, and did not leave her all the way down the aisle, which was the kind of look that you carry with you your whole life. The ceremony was straightforward and sincere. When Reverend Allen asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," in a clear voice that did not waver, because she had chosen this clearly, and she was not a woman who wavered over things she had chosen clearly. Elijah's "I do" was quieter but no less certain. He put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had ordered from the catalog in October, and that she had told him she wanted plain, because that was what she wanted, and he had listened. They were married. It was a simple fact and a profound one, and Susan Langston, who was now Susan Dalton, stood in the Clarendon church and felt the weight of it settle on her like something she had not known she was waiting to carry. The question of the two properties had been a matter of considerable practical discussion in the weeks before the wedding. There was a pragmatic question of what to do with the Langston homestead, which was a good property, and the Dalton ranch, which was a larger property, and the fence line between them, which had started all of this. In the end, they made a decision that felt exactly right to both of them. They would use the Dalton house as the main residence, because it was the larger house and could be properly made into a family home, but the Langston property would remain in Susan's name and would be folded into the operation as the East Pasture, expanding the grazing range significantly. The Langston house would become housing for hands during busy seasons, which solved a practical problem that Elijah had been facing for 2 years. It was her land. Her name remained on it. She had insisted on this, and he had agreed without hesitation, because this was exactly the kind of man he was. They moved her things to the Dalton house in December, and Susan remade the house in ways that were both practical and personal, bringing her father's tools and her mother's good cast iron and her own books, which mixed with Elijah's on the shared shelves in a way that she found deeply satisfying. She put proper curtains in the bedroom, a warm red cotton that made the room glow in the lamplight, and Elijah looked at them and said they were exactly right, and she believed him. Their first winter together was the kind of winter that reminds you why having someone beside you matters in the most concrete and daily way. The Panhandle winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, with several deep cold snaps that froze the water tanks and killed the grass and kept you close to the fire for days at a time. They worked it together, breaking ice from the tanks in the mornings, moving cattle to sheltered draws, keeping the windmill mechanisms from seizing in the cold. It was not a romantic kind of work, but it was together work, side by side, and Susan found that working alongside Elijah had exactly the quality she had hoped for, that he worked with her rather than around her, consulted her rather than directing her, trusted her judgment in the places she had more experience, and gave her his where he had more. They argued 3 times that winter, once about the best way to manage the East Pasture rotation, a genuine disagreement about land management that they resolved by trying her approach first and then his, and finding that a combination of both worked better than either alone. Once about whether to hire a 4th hand for the spring, which he wanted to do and she felt was premature given the finances, and she turned out to be right, and he conceded it gracefully. Once about something smaller and more personal that neither of them afterward could precisely reconstruct. One of those arguments that is really about tiredness and not about the subject at hand, and which resolved itself in the way such arguments between people who love each other should, with honesty and a willingness to be the first to reach across the distance. She discovered that he read in bed at night, always had a book going, and fell asleep with the lamp still burning, which she began to account for by leaving his lamp set low and taking hers down before she slept, so that she was not woken by the light when he finally drifted off. She discovered that he was a better cook than he had let on, that he made exceptional coffee and a very good beef and potato hash on Sunday mornings, which became a tradition between them that she anticipated with a pleasure she did not see any reason to conceal. He discovered that she was not a morning person in the sense that she needed about 20 minutes and her first cup of coffee before she was ready for conversation, which he accommodated with the consideration of a man who pays attention, setting her coffee ready on the stove and not speaking to her in anything but essential monosyllables until she had finished the first cup. He discovered that she had a particular soft spot for their dogs, all four of them now, Cal and Bess, and two Dalton dogs named Scout and Arrow, and that she talked to them in a low, private voice that she used for nothing else, and that moved something in him every time he heard it. Spring came back to the Panhandle in March, and it came beautifully, with a long, warm rain that soaked the ground and brought the grass up bright and new. And Susan stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it, and felt something so full and so right that she had to set the cup down and simply be still in it for a moment. She found out she was expecting in April, which she had suspected for 2 weeks, and confirmed with the certainty that women confirm these things, from the inside, before any external evidence is sufficient to convince. She told Elijah on a Sunday morning over his hash and coffee directly, because that was her way with everything. He put down his fork and looked at her across the table, and she watched every feeling he had move across his face in sequence, the surprise, the joy, the gravity, and then the joy again, larger than the first time. "Susan," he said. "I know," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and said nothing else for a moment, and she let him have the silence, and then he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" Which was the right question. Not about himself, not about the future, but about her right now, how she was. She appreciated that enormously. "Tired in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise well." "Then you should not be doing the fence work in the east pasture," he said, and then immediately raised a hand as she opened her mouth. "Not because I do not think you can, because I would prefer it, and because I have 2 hands who can do it." She looked at him for a moment and then let the argument go, because the truth was she had been thinking the same thing and had been annoyed at herself for thinking it, and his saying it first meant she did not have to argue with herself anymore. "The east pasture fence," she said, "can wait for Danny." The pregnancy was not difficult in any extraordinary way, but it was demanding in the ordinary ways. And the summer of 1883 was the summer of Susan learning to negotiate between what her body required and what her inclination demanded. She kept working because she was not constitutionally capable of sitting still, but she accepted help more readily than she had in her previous life, not because she was weak, but because she was carrying something that mattered more than any single act of self-sufficiency, and because the help was freely and lovingly offered. Elijah was attentive in a way that never tipped into smothering. He was simply present, consistently and reliably present, the kind of presence that does not announce itself but is always there when you reach for it. He rode with her when she wanted to ride. He sat with her in the evenings on the porch when the days were too hot and the evening air finally relented. He read to her sometimes, in bed at night, from whatever he was working through, and she would listen with her eyes closed and feel completely and perfectly at rest. Margaret came down from Kansas again in July, at Elijah's request, and her arrival was so welcome that Susan hugged her at the door with a genuineness that surprised them both and made the older woman laugh with real pleasure. "I was hoping you needed me," Margaret said. "I do," Susan said simply, and that was all. Their son was born in October of 1883, a healthy and emphatic boy who arrived in the Dalton house with a pair of lungs that left no room for uncertainty about his presence. They named him Daniel, after Elijah's father, which was Susan's suggestion, and they called him Dan from the first day because Margaret, who had been at the birth and was unmovable about staying for the first month, said that a baby called Daniel would take up too much air in the room. Dan was a solid and cheerful baby who slept in reasonable intervals and regarded the world with an interested equanimity that he had, Susan noted, from both parents. He had Elijah's dark eyes, and Susan's determined jaw and Margaret said he was the finest baby she had seen in a considerable number of years, which she said with the authority of a woman who had seen a considerable number of babies. She stayed 6 weeks rather than 1 month, which no one objected to in the slightest. The Dalton Ranch expanded in the years that followed with the orderly and satisfying growth that comes when a good operation is managed well, and the land is treated with proper respect. They hired 2 more hands, careful men that Elijah chose with the kind of judgment he brought to everything, and Pete remained as the foreman and moral backbone of the whole enterprise, a role he occupied with the comfortable authority of a man doing exactly what he was made for. Susan managed the east pasture, the Langston land, with the same attention she had always given it, and she kept her own separate ledger for it alongside the main ranch books, which Elijah regarded with an admiration he expressed with the particular quietness of a man who finds something wholly right in what he sees. They consulted on everything. They disagreed sometimes and resolved it always, because they had established early on the principle that resolution was not optional, that the sun did not go down on unresolved things between them if they could help it. Dan grew into a boy with tremendous energy and a gift for getting himself into situations that required parental intervention, and when Susan found out in the spring of 1886 that she was expecting again, she told Dan first because he was 2.5 and old enough to understand the word baby, and she liked to include him in things. "Baby," Dan said, with the gravity of a small person confronting a large concept. "Baby," Susan confirmed. Dan considered this and then went back to what he had been doing, which was attempting to teach Scout the dog to sit on command, which was going poorly for everyone involved. Their daughter arrived in November of 1886, and they named her Margaret, after her grandmother, who received the news by letter in Kansas, and sent back a letter so full of joy that Susan read it 3 times. The baby was called Maggie, immediately and unanimously, and she was a small and determined person from the very first day, which Susan regarded with a great affection that was partly recognition. They had 2 more years of good seasons on the ranch, of cattle prices holding and grass growing thick and the creek running reliable, and of Saturday afternoons on the porch that were no longer just theirs because Dan was old enough to be underfoot and opinionated about it, and Maggie, when she came, added her own particular intensity to the proceedings. Their life was full in every sense, full of work and noise and love, and the ongoing drama of a working ranch in the Texas Panhandle in the latter part of the 19th century. In the summer of 1888, the barbed wire question that had been building across the region came to a crisis point locally, as the larger cattlemen began asserting fence lines over land that smaller operations had always run across or used for access. Elijah came home one evening looking grim from a meeting in Clarendon, and Susan poured him coffee and sat across the table and waited. He told her that one of the big operations to the north, the Consolidated Cattle Company, was claiming a strip of land along the northern edge of the Dalton Range that included access to a secondary water source. The claim was of questionable legal standing, but the company had money for lawyers and connections to the county court that went back years. "How good are your papers?" she asked immediately. "Very good," he said. "I paid the surveyor properly and I have every deed and line documented." "Then you take it to the court," she said, "just as my father did with the water claim in 1879. You take the papers and you put them in front of the judge, and you do not let them intimidate you into settling for less than what is yours." He looked at her across the table. "I know," he said. "I just needed to hear it said." "Then I said it," she said. He did take it to the court in September of 1888. Susan went with him because she had the experience, and because she was his wife, and because no one who knew her would have expected otherwise. They sat in the county courthouse together, and Elijah presented his documentation, and his surveyor's measurements, and the Consolidated Company's lawyer made his arguments, and the judge, A man named Harder, who was known for being careful and fair though not quick, took 3 weeks to render his decision. The decision came down in Elijah's favor. The water access and the northern strip were confirmed as Dalton land. Susan read the document 3 times just to be certain and then looked up at Elijah and felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost physical. "I told you," she said. "You did," he said. "Your papers were good," she said. "My papers were perfect," he said, and there was a pride in it that she completely understood and fully shared. They rode home from Clarendon that evening through the October dusk, side by side on their horses. The Panhandle spread around them in the last of the light, and the grass was gold, and the sky was turning from blue to the deep colors of evening. And Susan looked at the land they were riding through, her land and his land and now their land, and felt the kind of contentment that has no particular word for it in English, but which is the deepest and most lasting of the good feelings. Pete retired in the spring of 1889, though retire is perhaps too absolute a word for a man who still came by the ranch 3 or 4 days a week, and offered opinions on everything, which Elijah accepted with a respectful attention that Pete appreciated and Susan found entirely charming. He built a small house on the edge of the Clarendon town limits, and kept 2 horses and a kitchen garden, and was, by all accounts, quite pleased with the arrangement. Danny, who was not young Danny anymore but a grown man of 26 with a few years of cattle work in Colorado and New Mexico behind him, came back to the Dalton Ranch in the fall of 1889 and took over as foreman with a competence that had arrived with his years and a cheerfulness that had never left him. He was good with the men and good with the cattle, and he had, somewhere in his travels, also become extremely good with horses, which gave him and Susan an entire separate depth of conversation that Elijah participated in with a willingness that he cheerfully acknowledged was not natural, but was learned for love. In the winter of 1889, Margaret Sr. made her annual visit from Kansas and spent 4 weeks at the Dalton house, and this time her health was a little less reliable than it had been, a fact that she declined to make any fuss about but that Susan noticed and attended to quietly and without drama, making certain the older woman was warm and well fed, and not expected to do more than she easily could. Margaret sat by the fire in the evenings with Maggie, who was 3 and who had taken a complete and absolute claim on her grandmother's heart, and she told the little girl stories about Kansas and about Elijah as a boy and about Daniel, the grandfather Maggie would never know. And Susan sat nearby mending or reading and listened, and felt the threads of time and family running through the room like something visible. On Margaret's last evening before the stage, she took Susan's hand at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and Elijah had gone to check on the horses for the night, and she looked at her daughter-in-law with those dark eyes and said, "You are exactly what I hoped for him." Susan looked at her and felt the ache of it behind her eyes, the good ache. "He makes that very easy to be," she said. Margaret squeezed her hand. "That is not entirely his doing," she said. When Elijah came back in from the horses, stamping the cold off his boots in the doorway, he found the 2 of them sitting at the table with their hands linked and their eyes slightly bright, and he looked between them with the expression of a man who knows better than to ask and is glad of it. "Coffee," he said. "Please," they said simultaneously, and then they looked at each other and laughed, and Elijah made the coffee and they sat up late talking until the fire burned low, the 3 of them together in the warm kitchen of the house that had become, entirely and irrevocably, a home. The 1890s came in with a shift in the cattle market that required some careful navigation. Prices softened and Elijah made conservative decisions about the herd size for 2 years running, decisions that Susan endorsed fully after looking at the numbers with him at the kitchen table on many long evenings, and that proved to be the right calls when the market stabilized, and several operations that had overextended found themselves in serious difficulty. They helped where they could. The Reyes family, Felipe and Miguel, who were by now operating their own small property east of Clarendon, had a rough year in 1891 when Miguel broke his arm badly in a fence accident and could not work properly for 3 months. Susan organized a rotating schedule among several neighboring families to help with the raised cattle work through the recovery, a thing she did without ceremony or expectation of acknowledgement, because it was the right thing to do, and that was sufficient reason. Dan at 7 was serious and responsible in ways that made both his parents simultaneously proud and slightly concerned, because no 7-year-old should be quite so earnest about the correct method of fence post-installation. They encouraged him actively in activities of no practical utility whatsoever, and he had a particular gift for drawing that Susan nurtured carefully, keeping him supplied with paper and pencil, and never suggesting that this gift was less important than the cattle work. Maggie at 4 was conducting the household according to her own internal logic, which was elaborate and detailed and changed without notice. She had opinions about where the dogs should sleep, about the arrangement of the kitchen pots, about whether the chickens were being addressed with sufficient respect when they were let out in the morning. Elijah called her the foreman of the house, which delighted her, and Susan called her daughter and meant it with her whole heart. The spring of 1893 brought something Susan had not quite prepared herself for, which was a letter from her mother in Amarillo saying that her sister was moving east and that she was uncertain about staying in Amarillo alone. Susan read the letter twice and then went and found Elijah in the barn where he was working over a saddle that needed repair, and she handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "What would you like to do?" She had been thinking about it since she read it. The house on the Langston property, which they used seasonally for hands, was a good solid house, well maintained, with 3 rooms and a proper kitchen. It had stood empty more than it had been occupied in recent years. "I would like to bring her home," she said, "to the Langston house. She could live there independently, but she would be close and we could make sure she is all right." He did not hesitate. "Write and tell her," he said. "We will get the house properly ready." Her mother came in May of 1893, a small and precise woman of 62 who had spent 12 years in Amarillo, and arrived back at the land. She had once wept over as an impossible hardship with a composure and a joy that told Susan everything she needed to know about what home meant. Ruth Langston walked through the Langston house, which Susan had spent 3 weeks making warm and comfortable for her, and she stopped at the window of the front room that looked west toward the Dalton house, and she said, "I can see your lights from here." "Yes," Susan said, "on clear nights." "Good," Ruth said, with a finality that closed the subject completely. Ruth was a revelation to the children. Dan took to her gravely, and she to him, and they spent hours together in the kitchen garden that she established at the Langston house with impressive speed and efficiency, discussing the merits of different vegetable varieties with an earnestness that matched perfectly. Maggie adored her with the full and uncomplicated force of a child who has found exactly the right person, and Ruth told her stories and let her braid her hair, and never once suggested that her opinions about the chickens were anything other than completely reasonable. Elijah was patient and kind with Ruth in the way he was patient and kind with everything that mattered to Susan, and Ruth, who had sharp eyes under her gentle manner, watched him for approximately 2 weeks and then told Susan over tea at the Langston house that he was a good man and that she was glad. "I know it," Susan said. "Your father would have liked him," Ruth said. Susan was quiet for a moment. "I believe so," she said. "He liked men who knew what land was for." Dan turned 10 in October of 1893, and Elijah taught him to rope that fall, and the education of a Panhandle rancher's son proceeded apace, with Dan absorbing it all with his particular seriousness, and Elijah teaching with a patience and care that Susan watched from the corral fence, sometimes with a warmth in her chest that she did not have to name because she knew it completely. Maggie turned 7 and announced that she intended to learn to rope as well, which she proceeded to do with a determination that was absolutely unmistakable in its parentage. She was not as naturally gifted as Dan at the mechanics of it, but she worked at it with a tenacity that overcame any deficit. And she was roping fence posts reliably by the end of the winter, which she regarded as entirely adequate and which Elijah regarded with enormous pride. The years moved through the Panhandle the way the seasons did, with their own particular rhythms and their own gifts and difficulties. There were dry years and wet years, good cattle prices and hard ones, the ongoing slow transformation of the frontier as more wire went up and more settlers came, and the open range that had defined this place began its long closing. There were the ongoing conversations, sometimes urgent, always present, about the land and what it was becoming, about the rights of smaller operations, about the water and the grass that belonged, in some essential way that went beyond legal claim, to everyone who lived on it. Susan kept her ledgers. She kept her father's papers in a cedar chest under the bed. She maintained the fence line between the Langston property and the Dalton proper with the same careful attention she gave everything. And when Elijah occasionally suggested that she let him or the hands take it over entirely, she declined with the same pleasant firmness she had maintained since the very first afternoon, and he received the declination with the same respect he had always shown it. Their life together had the quality of something built correctly, built with good materials and honest labor and attention to what mattered, and like a well-built thing it lasted, and it did not just last but grew stronger as the years put their weight on it. In the autumn of 1895, Pete came by the ranch for what had become his weekly Sunday dinner, a tradition they had maintained for 6 years, and he sat at the big kitchen table and ate his beef and vegetables, and told a story about a mule that was funny enough to make Dan spit his water, which earned Dan a look from Susan that Dan found considerably more frightening than a shout. Pete watched all of this with his knowing eyes, and afterward, when Elijah was walking him to his horse in the yard, he said, as casually as a man remarks upon the weather, "You know, when I saw her come down that hill with your cattle behind her, I thought, well, there it is." Elijah looked at him. "You thought that immediately?" "The moment she said 17, Pete said. "I have never seen a man count cattle so slowly in my life, and I have watched a considerable amount of cattle counting." Elijah laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from the same place Susan's did, from somewhere deep and genuine. "She knew," Elijah said. "I know she knew," Pete said. "She is the most observant human being I have ever met, which is saying something." "It is," Elijah agreed. Pete mounted his gray horse, still going strong despite his years, and touched his hat and rode toward town, and Elijah stood in the yard and looked at the house where the lamplight was warm in the windows, and listened to the sound of his son's voice and his daughter's voice and his wife's voice moving together inside, and felt the particular rightness of a life that has arrived, through work and luck and love, at something real. He went back inside, and Susan was at the stove finishing the dishes, and he came and stood beside her and picked up the drying cloth without being asked and began to dry the plates she handed him, and they worked through the stack in comfortable quiet, and then she handed him the last cup and he dried it and set it on the shelf, and she leaned back against the counter and looked at him. "Pete was here a long time tonight," she said. "He is good company," Elijah said. "He is," she agreed. "He was looking at you strangely when you walked out to his horse. He told me that he knew, the first afternoon you came, how it was going to go." She considered this. "He did know," she said. "I saw it on his face when you were counting." Elijah looked at her. "I was not very subtle." "No," she said, "you were not." He smiled at her, that smile that had not changed since the first afternoon, warm and real and entirely his. He said, "Are you sorry you stayed?" It was a question he had never asked before, perhaps because he had never needed to, but she took it seriously as she took all questions from him. She looked at him, at the man she had come to return cattle to 13 years ago and never really left, not in any way that mattered, and she thought about the 17 cattle and the slow counting and the coffee in his house, and the storm on her porch and the stars and the wedding in December and Dan and Maggie, and all the years of the good life they had built here together on the grass of the Texas Panhandle. "Not for one moment," she said. "Not for one single moment." He put his hand against her cheek, warm and familiar, and as certain as anything she had ever known, and she leaned into it slightly, and the lamplight was warm around them, and outside the Panhandle night stretched wide and full of stars, the same stars that had been over this land forever and would be over it long after them. And Susan Dalton, who had ridden 12 miles with 2 dogs and 17 cattle, and made a man count slowly because he did not want her to leave, stood in her kitchen with her husband's hand against her face, and felt the full and perfect weight of a life that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. Dan appeared in the kitchen doorway, 8 years past his earliest memories of the dogs and the porch and the stories, now a nearly grown young man of 16 who had his father's build and his mother's eyes and both their stubbornness in full measure. "Maggie says the cat has had kittens in the barn," he said. "Tell Maggie to leave them alone for tonight and let the mother settle," Susan said, without moving. Dan disappeared. They heard his footsteps going toward the back of the house and the sound of Maggie's protest at the verdict, and then a discussion conducted at moderate volume about the nature of kittens and maternal feline instinct that suggested Dan was relaying the information with more editorial commentary than strictly necessary. Susan looked at Elijah. Elijah looked at Susan. They were both smiling. "Tomorrow," she said, "I am going to ride the south fence line. It needs looking at before winter." "I will come with you," he said. "I know you will," she said. She turned back to wipe the last of the counter down, and he folded the drying cloth and hung it on the hook, and the ordinary evening of an extraordinary life continued around them, warm and real, and full of everything that mattered, built from nothing more and nothing less than a woman who came to return some stray cattle and a man who counted them so slowly, so very slowly, because he did not want her to leave, which, in the end, she never did.